Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this A ThinkIn with Nadhim Zahawi, the Minister responsible for the vaccine deployment in the UK. Firstly, Nadhim, thank you. I appreciate there are a fair few demands on your time, so thank you for making time to join us. You haven't been to a ThinkIn before. Our aim in this is to hold an open news meeting, so not just sort of questions and points of view from me, but from as many people as possible in the course of the coming hour. Of course, what we want to understand is what next in the vaccine rollout, how to understand the threat of the variants, how to understand the implications for the roadmap to a return to something more normal in the future. I'm going to start, though, if I might, by just heading straight into the question about variants. I should say that when the vaccine deployment began, many people in many newsrooms, including our own, questioned whether or not you would be able to hit the target of 15 million vaccinations by the middle of February. I just checked, it's 12.9 million as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. So I should say, firstly, a recognition of the achievement that you and the thousands of people working on that have achieved, and it's an extraordinary thing to have done. And also thank you. It's changing the dynamics of the year and of the pandemic. But of course, the thing that really has changed too is that since it began, Nadhim, we went from the virus versus the vaccine to the variants versus the vaccine. And I wonder whether you can tell us, what's the process now for developing new vaccines? Will they have to go through the same clinical trials process, or are you going to be able to do that much more quickly to bring new variants of the vaccine out to protect people?
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. In many ways, it's humbling. Sometimes I feel like I'm an imposter because I stand on the shoulders of the real heroes. We have an incredible team, the operations team, that meets every day, every morning, 8 a.m., 7 days a week, doing their job. Our armed forces are integrated into that brilliant NHS team. And of course, we've essentially stood up a deployment infrastructure that best probably described by Brigadier Phil Prosser, who is the commander of 101 Logistics Brigade, as standing up a supermarket chain in about a month and then growing it 20% every week. And so we stand now, I think on Saturday, we got 1 hour between 11 and 12 to almost 1,000 jabs a minute, 979, I think it was, on Saturday. So that gives you sort of the I guess the scale of this operation.
Yeah.
And the army of volunteers, I genuinely stand on the shoulders of heroes on this. In terms of where the virus is heading, so viruses mutate. The more you vaccinate, the more they attempt to survive and therefore mutate. There are around 4,000 mutations already around the world. We have one of the best genome sequencing industries, ecosystems in the world. We account for just under 50% of all sequencing of the COVID variants to date. And we're keeping track of all of that all the time, working with the current manufacturers. So each manufacturer, whether it's Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, who use messenger RNA, I'll come back to that in a second, or the more traditional DNA vaccines like the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, they all are looking at improving their vaccines, looking at variant vaccines to deal with the variant viruses that are mutating. We are not only deploying at pace the two vaccines that we have approved, which work incredibly effectively on the dominant virus at the moment in the UK, which is the UK or the Kent virus, as it's described. But at the same time, we're looking at the future as well. And the future looks like this. One, you work with the current manufacturers and look at what they're producing and see what you think is sort of the most likely, either a booster or a annual vaccination process that you might require. Two, what we've just done, what I think is an incredibly important deal with the third messenger RNA technology company. It's called CureVac, a very, very successful company in Germany. They're going to come to the UK. We're going to work with them because what we can offer them is that genome sequencing heft, that muscle together, we're going to be able to track all the different variants, decide rapidly on which variant we think is going to become dominant in the way, the world has done with flu. What happens with flu, just for your audience, is the World Health Organization every year decides which 2 or 3 variants of flu are the ones that are most dominant. That's all agreed. And then the flu manufacturers, the vaccine manufacturers, create a cocktail of 3 variants of a vaccine, and then we have a flu vaccination program. So we will
and Nadhim, forgive me for interrupting, but what I want to understand is, do each of these new vaccines go through the same clinical trial process that this original, Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine went through, or are you going to be able to do it much more quickly? And if so, how much more quickly?
So this is in many ways why we are becoming a very attractive place for the world to come and manufacture vaccines, because our regulator, they are independent of government, run by a brilliant lady called June Rain, who I highly recommend you should have on one of these ThinkIns, have already begun to do the thinking around the variants that are appearing. So you don't need to go through the same process. If you have an approved vaccine, it just becomes a variant vaccine. Therefore, the approval process is shortened to, between 30 and 40 days, you can have your next vaccine ready for manufacture. And so, as Jonathan Van Tam described today, and he and I talked over the weekend, and I described to the media over on Sunday, we are very likely to look at a booster in the autumn if we think there is a virus that may escape, or the current vaccines are less effective. At the moment, just to reassure you, our 2 vaccines are incredibly effective on the dominant virus in the United Kingdom, which is why I'm so positive about our vaccine rollout. But the same applies with other vaccines as well. So the other vaccines that we have options. So if you take the Valneva vaccine, where the Prime Minister visited Scotland, that is, again, it has, I think, 2 really sort of interesting attributes. One is, unlike the current vaccines, it doesn't just work on the spike of the virus, it works on the whole of the virus. So because it itself is a whole inactivated virus that creates the Valneva vaccine. We've announced a deal with Valneva. We've gone further. We've bought another 40 million doses for next year in anticipation of an annual vaccination program, where we're able to obviously rapidly produce that variant vaccine and manufacture it in Scotland.
And Nadhim, sorry, just so I understand, what you're saying is that variant vaccines will be approved, or can be approved, in 30 to 40 days if the original vaccine, if you like, has already had the clinical trial approval.
Correct.
So in a sort of practical sense, from the moment of detection of a variant, you could see within a matter of 2, possibly 3 months, a new vaccine rollout to respond to that variant. Is that a reasonable time frame?
That would be, yeah. I mean, I would say sort of 30 to 40 days, and then maybe allow, as we saw with even the current vaccines, manufacturing of vaccines is a challenging process, and you would allow sort of, I would say, between 3 and 4 or 5 months is you would actually have volume available to vaccinate.
And then, do you have a sense yet of how many variants we should begin to expect? I know you said there are 4,000 variations. That's different, though, to a variant that really has an impact on the population. When you look out through 2021, beyond Kent, beyond the South African variant, beyond the Brazilian one, how many more do you think we should be preparing for?
So that's it'd be impossible to answer that question, in the sense that the more we vaccinate, the more the virus will attempt to survive and therefore mutate. At the moment, obviously, we're seeing these mutations in the spike, and obviously the brilliant scientists, and I'm a chemical engineer, not a virologist in that sense. The important thing is to make sure you have the ability, the science, to be able to sequence the variant of the virus, and then the technology to be able to produce the vaccine. And we are making sure that the UK has both that and then of course the regulatory environment to rapidly approve, and then the manufacturing piece as well, so that we will always, effectively future-proof beyond this stage. What happens, what the virus does next, we'll be prepared for it.
And I was interested in your point, Nadhim, about stocking for 2022. What we're beyond just the autumn vaccination round, the boosters. What if I understand you correctly, you're saying is people should begin to expect that they're going to be vaccinated once, possibly multiple times a year for the coming few years.
That's right. So the current thinking, if you speak to Jonathan Van Tam or Chris Whitty or the scientific teams that are developing their new thinking around the variant vaccines, we will probably enter a world a little like flu vaccines, where you have an annual jab of a COVID vaccine and a flu vaccine, and there are those now beginning to think about a combined jab of flu and COVID.
Right. Or that you would have one jab that would combine both of them.
But this is where messenger RNA technology is so exciting, not just, by the way, in dealing with this terrible pandemic and COVID, but in terms of treatments for cancers and so on. In the past, it was very, very difficult to produce vaccines so rapidly, but messenger RNA technology now allows this rapid production of vaccines for viruses, even if they mutate rapidly.
And does that mean, sorry, Nadhim, does that mean that you think even by the end of this year, by autumn 2021, people could begin to start taking the combined COVID flu jab?
No, I suspect that that's probably in future years. It's some of the new messenger RNA scientists are looking at whether they can combine the two together. I think for the autumn, I would certainly say we should expect a booster for the current vaccines, and then ultimately an annual vaccination program.
And can I just understand, what are you saying to people who are getting the vaccine, getting the jab? Because I think, and maybe I was naive in this, that I thought that once you had the vaccination, you'd be, or at least feel protected. But we hear more and more stories now, and you've seen some of them in the chat already, of people saying, look, they've had the first jab and they're still getting COVID-19. So what's a reasonable expectation of someone who's had the jab?
So this is one of the things that we were trying to get the message across rapidly, that we saw actually happening in Israel, where people were having that first jab and then thinking that they were protected immediately. Of course, the physiology of this is your body has to then be allowed to react to the vaccine and begin to produce the antibodies and T cells, which is why you've got to allow at least 3 weeks after your first jab, where you really have to be very careful and continue to be careful in terms of hands, face, space, and following the rules until you build up that immunity. And so what we're saying to people is, even after having the jab, please continue to follow the rules. And until we have more data, we're running 2 large pieces of evidence gathering. The Public Health England is. One is called Siren, which is testing frontline healthcare workers who've had the vaccine. And one is in care homes, residents of care homes who are in category 1. If you remember the top 4 categories, they were category 1 on the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization list. And that's the Vivaldi project. Both of those will begin to report, which is why the Prime Minister will hopefully have more evidence available to him on the 22nd of February to be able to set out that roadmap to opening hopefully schools on the 8th of March, and then gradually reopening the economy as we begin to see the impact of the vaccination program. So if you take the mid-February, which is sort of next Monday, and roll the clock forward 2 to 3 weeks, where all that first 4 cohorts, which is 88% of mortality, is protected after 3 weeks from the jab, we should be beginning to see the impact on hospitalization and, of course, death ultimately.
Nadhim, I want to come back to that March 8th and the expectations on that, but I just wanted to finish up on this, or try and get a little further on this point about infections amongst people who've been vaccinated. And Emily Ball, I've seen in the chat, has raised this point. I don't know, Emily, whether or not you want to put it to Nadhim Zahawi. Hello.
Hi. Yes, nice to meet you. It was just a quick one. I'm a GP, and I've had my first dose of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, as have a number of my vulnerable patients and my colleagues. I'm rather concerned that obviously a lot of us are going past the 21 days for which there is the data for giving the second dose. And indeed, a number of our patients are starting to contract COVID. And today, one of our staff members and her partner, we received notification they had tested positive over the weekend. They're both fit, young and healthy, but are extremely ill with COVID, far more than I would expect, given their risk factors. Obviously, it's very concerning that this seems to be happening, especially since a large number of the people who have only received the first dose of the COVID vaccine are in fact healthcare professionals. And if we end up ill and unwell, who's going to look after the population? There's also no guarantee, of course, that when it gets to the 12 weeks and we do hopefully receive that second dose of the Pfizer BioNTech, there's no guarantee that we still have any immunity to boost, because there's no data. So I'm rather concerned about how we're going to manage, and in fact, are people more unwell after they've been vaccinated if they then contract it?
Thank you. Nadhim.
So Emily, in terms of the dosing interval, so the period between first dose and second dose being extended to up to 12 weeks, that decision was made by the combination of the regulator, and Pfizer themselves put out a statement saying that it is up to the national regulator of each country, of each nation that's using the Pfizer vaccine to decide on that. So the MHRA, with the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization, they're the experts, and of course the 4 chief medical officers of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland all agreed that actually that dosing interval going up to 12 weeks is the right thing to do. After the 15 days, this is Pfizer's own data, up to 21 days, the first dose offers about 89% protection. And as Jonathan Van Tam has said before, physiologically, it's nigh impossible for that to just drop off a cliff after 21 days. And so that's what we're following. In terms of just reassuring you.
Nadhim, sorry, sorry to interrupt, and just to jump on the point that Emily was making. I appreciate your point that says that the interval was cleared by the sort of medical authorities, by your scientific advisors. But I suppose the question posed by Emily's point is our understanding changing now we're getting evidence in the broader population? Are you thinking there's a bigger risk here than we originally realized?
So the independent regulator looks at all adverse events after vaccination through the yellow card system, which Emily will be familiar with. And we are not seeing anything that would worry us or would want us to change that dosing interval. But just to reassure you, Emily, and your patients, we've already begun to reserve the second doses at NHS England. Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland are doing the same thing. We will begin second dosing in March. And so that up to 12 weeks will be absolutely adhered to. So if you've had a Pfizer BioNTech first dose, you'll get a Pfizer BioNTech second dose. If you've had an Oxford AstraZeneca first dose, you'll get an Oxford AstraZeneca second dose.
Nadhim, thank you. I said I'd come to March the 8th, which I will in a moment. There was one question from Anushka Sharma I saw, which was advice for pregnant women in terms of the vaccine. Is your advice go ahead, or what's the medical advice on that?
Thank you. Yes, Anushka, speak to your doctor or GP and go ahead, because that is very much something that the regulator has looked at and has made it very clear that as long as you consult your doctor or GP about your specific circumstances, but ultimately it is absolutely the right thing to do is to be vaccinated if you are in those 4 cohorts that we're currently vaccinating up till the middle of February, and then obviously opening up to 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9.
All right, but Nadhim, I just want to pass on to you. Julia Simons was just registered in the chat that she's a junior doctor who got the first jab and then did get COVID-19 afterwards. She wasn't particularly ill herself. I just pass this on for your knowledge, but she did then infect her housemates who had not been vaccinated. So there's obviously a risk here. Can I just touch on or try and investigate this point about March the 8th? I think a lot of people who are not necessarily in the vaccination program now are thinking, okay, well, they've hit the 15 million. The Prime Minister's setting out February the 22nd to unveil plans for March the 8th. Is the plan to have vaccinated all teachers by March the 8th?
No. So, James, you're already banking the 15 million. We haven't hit the 15 million yet, but that was good journalism. Nevertheless, we will, and I'm confident we will hit the 15 million, which is the top 4 cohorts that I described earlier, by the middle of February. And then we'll keep going to cohort 5, which is the over 65s. And then cohort 6, which is really important because that is 16-year-olds up to 64 who may have underlying conditions that would make them a priority. That's a big part of this vaccination program. That in itself will take in a lot of teachers who may be worried or who may have underlying conditions that would put them into that category. Of course, a number of other, we've had a debate about police officers and shop workers. If you're over 55 or if you have underlying conditions that put you at risk, you'll be captured in cohort 6, or obviously if you're over 50, then in cohort 9. That's phase 1. So once we have finished phase 1, by May, we are already looking at going back to the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization to ask them the questions and to get them to consider whether we should prioritize teachers, police officers, prison officers, shop workers who through their profession, through their work, may come into contact with much greater volumes of the virus because they come into contact with more people. And the JCVI will advise us as to what the next phase will look like, and we will follow that advice.
And Nadhim, sorry, the reason I ask the question is twofold. One is in posing the question yourself, in asking whether or not, when you get to the end of phase 1, whether it would be the right thing to prioritize teachers, police officers, prison officers, frontline workers in retail. By posing the question, you almost answer it yourself, right? Which is clearly there's going to be huge public pressure to do exactly that. And it's the sensible thing to do in terms of public services. The gap to me seems to be the expectation that's now created of a return to school on March the 8th, but before the vaccination of teachers. So what I don't understand is how can there be a public expectation that children are going to go back to school and all of the knock-on impacts of that if the teachers themselves haven't been vaccinated?
So that's exactly the point. Forgive me, maybe I didn't sort of explain it well enough. The Joint Committee on Vaccination looked at, whether it's the teaching profession or other professions, they looked at BAME, and they obviously consulted the ONS data on infections, and they fell very, very clearly on the side of the 9 categories based on age, and of course those who are clinically extremely vulnerable, which is category 4, and category 6, which is if you have underlying conditions that put you at risk if you're 16 to 64. So you could be a teacher, yes. and if you're at risk, you'll be vaccinated in category 5 and 6, which we're getting to now, which will essentially be that's the sort of next target for us rapidly. So the idea then, sorry, forgive me, Joe, just one last thing. Once we've finished phase 1, the reason we have to ask the question is because obviously we want to understand clinically what the JCVI will recommend. Is it better to vaccinate all teachers or think about age range first against profession? And that's a clinical decision that the JCVI will have to make.
I understand. Sorry, Nadhim, I do understand that. What I don't understand is why it seems that the government is walking into an argument of its own making by saying, look, we'd like to get schools reopened from March the 8th, even though we know that phase 1 of the vaccination program won't be finished by March the 8th, so that teachers won't be vaccinated. So the government will be saying, we want to reopen schools, and teachers will quite understandably be saying, but we haven't been vaccinated yet.
Yes, but if you are a teacher who is in any, say, let's say take category 6, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have underlying conditions, then you will be offered the vaccine in the first phase. If you are a teacher who is 26 and is perfectly healthy, then of course we're looking at phase 2 and asking the question of the JCVI. The JCVI.
But sorry, Nadhim. The JCVI is going to be asked the question once you get to the end of phase 1.
Well, before then, you have to ask them before then.
I'm talking about this March 8th. What I'm trying to get to is, can you really reopen schools before you've vaccinated teachers?
Yes, you can, because actually the reason we ended up having to close schools, and it's the last thing we wanted to do was close schools, was because the new variant, the Kent variant, the UK variant, was more infectious, and it was the interaction of families because of the school that effectively made the decision for us to say we better close them, although we don't want to. But schools, one, and you've heard this from Chris Whitty, you don't have to believe a politician, the chief medical officer will tell you that they are safe. But the difficulty we had is that they encourage further social interaction between households. And that's why we decided to close them. So to reopen them, we will reopen them safely, because we will have, by I hope March the 8th, the impact of the vaccination program on the top 4 categories, which is 88% of death.
Well, I appreciate that. But Nadhim, it seems as though you're saying you can reopen schools without vaccinating teachers by March the 8th. Teachers over the age of 60 will most likely have had the vaccine. Teachers under the age of 60 won't have had the vaccine.
Well, and of course, you will capture teachers who are clinically extremely vulnerable.
Do you think that's enough? Do you think that's going to be safe enough?
Well, again, I rely on the experts. The Joint Committee have looked at this and have come out very clearly to say that those who are most vulnerable to serious illness and hospitalization and death are the categories 1 to 9. And some teachers will be captured in category 4, some will be in category 6, and some obviously will be category 9. But that is the clinical decision of the experts, and I have to follow that. That's my decision making is based on evidence rather than simply deciding randomly. I think it'd be very wrong for us to, without the evidence, to decide randomly, because other professions will also have an equal shout to say, well, how about us? Which is why we have the JCVI.
No, I can understand that. And just one final thing for people, because everyone's beginning to turn their mind to this question of schools reopening. Nadhim, it's the point that you're making about the risk, that there's not risk, as I understand it, to children, or the risk to children is very low. The risk is either the social interaction between parents, but isn't it also the risk of children themselves carrying the virus, infecting others, and then spreading it between families and therefore also to teachers? That there is a risk of spreading infection through the schools reopening. Was that not the lesson of the Kent variant?
Yeah, exactly. The social interaction between households was the reason for the school closure, which we took. In terms of teachers being infected, or more likely to be infected, the JCVI looked at this, and if you look at their report, they come down very clearly and say that actually there is no more risk in that particular profession of being more likely to be infected, and very clearly came down on the side of age as the determining factor as to whether you get seriously ill from COVID or hospitalized or die.
All right. Can I do a slight handbrake turn? I realize there are many people here this evening, with questions, and they're almost all personal. So I'm not going to try and go through every one, but I think there are beginning to be some questions, Nadhim, about gaps in the vaccine rollout. So people recognize the data that you're getting, and the fact that I can look and see 12.9 million people as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. What you can't necessarily see is exactly the granular data, who's getting it, which areas, which parts of the country are delivering better than others. I don't know whether Simon Briscoe joined us, because I saw a message from him earlier, but this question about the level of transparency. Simon, are you there if you want to weigh in? There you are, yes.
Yeah, hello, thank you, James, and good evening, Minister. And if I can also add my personal thanks and admiration at the rollout, because it is impressive. But as James said, the headline numbers are great, but I love my data, and I really don't understand why you won't tell us how many care home residents have been vaccinated and how many healthcare workers have been vaccinated and so forth. And I think thus far, it probably hasn't mattered too much, because we're still excited by the headline numbers. But now, last weekend, you did ask us to believe that, in effect, all care home residents had been vaccinated without ever publishing the number that have been vaccinated. And I just fear, as these further headlines and targets come along, there'll be growing skepticism about the detail of the data. So I suppose my question to you is, as I understand it, this is NHS data. So my question is the NHS not sharing it with you and ministers, or is it the ministers who are choosing not to share it with the population and the people?
Thank you, Simon. Look, my sort of mantra from day one is data is our ally in this endeavor. And the more we can share, the better the outcome will be. So we began by the NHS publishing weekly data. We moved to daily data, and now we deliver to local government almost ward level data, because we need local government. Look, by the way, and they are completely integrated in this deployment. We can't do this deployment without our colleagues in local government being on board, whether it's identifying sites or reaching the hard to reach groups. And we can talk more about that, including BAME, where now we collect the ethnicity data of people being vaccinated. And I want the NHS to publish data at CCG level, which will happen very, very soon, once they've sort of gone through making sure the data is robust. The one thing that the NHS, I think rightly, by the way, ask ministers to do is to say, look, of course, I understand you want us to publish more data, but we've got to make sure the data is robust, and therefore there's a little bit of a lag time, but you'll see us publishing CCG level data, which I'm sure will enjoy. One, going through. Two, it is exactly how we need to work with local government, because we need to be able to identify those communities. The United Kingdom has very high levels of acceptance of vaccines, highest in the world, according to the polling that I've seen. I think it runs about 85% of the adult population saying they will very likely or most likely be vaccinated. The 15% that is vaccine hesitant skews heavily towards BAME communities. And that's a dangerous thing, because the virus, we talked about mutations and variants earlier, if the adult population is vaccinated, but a particular community or ethnic minority aren't protected, the virus will find them and it'll go through them like wildfire. And that we have to stop, which is why we are putting so much resource and effort into making sure we communicate in 13 different languages. We make those people that they trust actually are the people that they go to, their GPs, their nurses from BAME communities who've already been vaccinated, tell the story of how important vaccines are to them. But on data, I just want to reassure you, Simon, we are making sure we share as much, and very soon you'll see the CCG level data being published as well, so you can interrogate.
Nadhim, thank you, and Simon, thank you too. Can I just bring in Albie Cohen and Jessie Hill and John Hill, just to touch on one specific thing, Nadhim, which is vaccine hesitancy or vaccine refuseniks. People, even those people in frontline care who are choosing not to take up the vaccine. I don't know whether or not Albie Cohen is there, or John Albie.
Yeah, hiya, thank you. Yes, so I recently went to a vaccinator training and I'm hoping to start vaccinating in the next week. And they obviously do rollouts to care, fantastic, thanks. And they obviously do rollouts to care homes, and they go in their little groups. And anecdotally, they have obviously very good uptake with the residents. And with the care home workers there, they were citing, and this was said in the chat as well, about 40% uptake with care home workers. This could be 60%, I could have got it the wrong way around. Regardless, this is really low, and that seems contradictory with the position that you hold as a care provider to protect your patients. And I know when you were talking about vaccine passports, you said, we don't want to infringe on someone's autonomy. However, by not taking the vaccine, are you not putting them at risk, potentially putting their lives at risk, and thus infringing on the people that you're taking care of's autonomy? How can it not be mandatory to be in a position like that, where the vaccine got out of hand in care homes, the pandemic in care homes, to not have the vaccine mandatory if you're in that role? So that's just kind of what I'm curious about, because it seems like you've got bad uptake there.
Albie, thank you. And Nadhim, for what it's worth, my colleague who's the design director at Tortoise, John Hill, had exactly the same thing, the call about the care home, as well, saying 40% of people saying, 40% of carers not taking up the vaccine. Do you hear a lot of this? And if so, what can you do about it?
So both Albie and to John, it's a great question. And Albie, I'm so glad that you're going to be one of our vaccinators. I think we've trained something like 80,000 vaccinator army, and thank you for doing that. So in terms of care home residents, we're at 93%. The reason we are not at 100% is partly because there'll be some residents who have got COVID and you can't vaccinate them. You've got to go back after 28 days. So the plan is to return 4 times to care homes. First time for first dose, second time for those who've had to wait 28 days. And of course, both times you're able to do both, the residents and the work and the staff. And then third time for the second dose, and then fourth time to hopefully, try and make sure you mop up, you get to as far as you can in terms of residents. Staff are in many ways more challenging because BAME communities, which is what I tried to describe in answer to the earlier question from Simon about some of that hesitancy, and I will just describe it in an example to you. So Nikki Kanani, who some of you would have seen standing next to Matt Hancock at the press conference tonight, is the director of primary care in the NHS. She herself is a GP, and she goes out vaccinating. She was doing a care home, and after finishing all the residents, they began vaccinating the staff, and a 60-year-old BAME lady said, "No, my family never takes vaccines. I'm not being vaccinated. Thank you very much." After 4 hours of watching her colleagues get vaccinated, talking to Nikki sharing information with her, just before Nikki left, she tapped her on the shoulder and said, "You know what, I will get vaccinated. I think it's good for me, good for my safety, my family, and I've learned enough to make me feel confident." So we've got to make sure we continue to share information, to be transparent with particular communities who have that hesitancy, and recognize it. And there's no point us not understanding that. Hence why we're spending a lot of time on the uptake strategy. You'll hear more from me in the next few days on that. We've launched the community champions with local government. We've put £23 million to identify community champions who can identify those groups who are hesitant, including those who work in the NHS and in care homes, but we'll continue to do so. Look, let me put it in perspective, right? The NHS modelling was for 75% uptake nationally amongst all adults, right? We are smashing that record at the moment. So we're getting, over 90% of over 80s, over 90% of over 75s, 93% of residents of care homes. Yes, of course, those who look after them is not yet at 90%, but we'll continue to offer.
But sorry, Nadhim, sorry, forgive me. I just want to pick up on this point about care home staff rather than care home residents.
Yes.
There are a number of people. Bridget Gregory, for example, in the chat just says, "I don't understand, if you risk giving the residents the virus, why is it not mandatory for you to have the vaccine?"
Because we don't mandate vaccines in the United Kingdom. And it's much.
So someone in the chat says that, sorry, Nadhim, someone in the chat said, "We do mandate Hep B."
Yeah, I hear you. And at the moment, I would much rather do this through persuasion, through working with leaders in the health and social care sector, and of course leaders in whether it's faith or communities. And I think that is a much better way. The reason we have such high acceptance of vaccines, of the COVID vaccines in the UK, is because I think of that sort of transparency and that openness of the way we've approached things. I think it's important.
Sorry, Nadhim. Sorry, forgive me. I understand. I totally understand the point, which says, look, we don't want to be a nation that mandates vaccinations, nationwide. But you can see that people who've put loved ones into care homes, or who have loved ones, I should say, in care homes, are saying to themselves, I want my family member or loved one to have the vaccine, but I definitely want the people who care for them to have the vaccine too. Is it not reasonable to expect that it's mandatory for care home staff to have the vaccine?
As I say, I disagree. I think it's much better to say to people, it's good for you, and that you do it because it's the right thing to do, which is why we're getting there. We're getting much higher acceptance than any other nation in the world. And vaccines are not the silver bullet. You also have the testing regime in care homes. So to start mandating it and be discriminatory, because you end up having people lose their jobs because currently they're a little bit hesitant about a vaccine, I think would be the wrong thing to do. I'd much rather persuade them through my uptake strategy, which you're going to see more on it in the next few days, than go down the route of mandation, because I don't think that's how we do things in the United Kingdom. And I think we're getting such high levels of acceptance where it is really impressive that we're in these sort of 90% numbers in the adult population. That's the way to do things. I think once you start mandating it, you fuel the anti-vax suspicion that this is some sort of, the government makes you do this stuff.
Okay, can I just on that then, can we just touch on the question of vaccine passports, right? I don't understand, I saw you talking to Andrew Marr yesterday. Forgive me, Nadhim, I don't understand the argument that says we're not a nation that mandates vaccines and therefore we're not having vaccine passports. They're two separate things. One is people who voluntarily have the vaccine can then have a vaccine passport, which could enable them to travel. It might enable them to do certain things in their workplace. Why would that not make it easier to get our lives and our economy back up and running?
So everyone who's had a vaccine, their records are kept by their GP through the National Immunisation Vaccination System. And so if they need to be able to prove they've had the vaccine, they are perfectly able to do that. Some GPs have it on an electronic format that they can email it to you and send it to you, as I was reminded after my Andrew Marr interview. And so there's nothing wrong with that. In the same way that you have to prove you've had a pre-departure test before you enter the United Kingdom or when you enter other countries, then that's the same sort of thing.
So let's ask you, are we, just so that we save ourselves some time, Nadhim, are we in danger of arguing about nothing here? I.e., there is going to be a formal confirmation that you can get that you've had the vaccine, and if any country seeks it or if any employer seeks it, you're going to, in a digital way, be able to confirm that you've received the vaccination.
Well, that's all, as I said, that's available through your GP already, and a number of them do it electronically anyway. Your own records are available to you.
So an electronic confirmation of a vaccine and a vaccine passport, these seem to me to be the same thing, or no?
No, they're not, because you will know better than most, James, because you've been in the media for a very long time, a lot longer than I've been a politician, that a vaccine passport carries with it a sort of whether it's a perception or otherwise, that somehow you have to have this thing, and that's not where we are in. That's not the place where.
Nadhim, sorry, but that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. Sorry, just if I may, I think that the government is arguing against vaccine passports, fending off an idea that this is somehow A, mandatory, which it isn't, or B, some government oversight of individual citizens, i.e. an infringement of liberties and privacy. But actually, people want to be able to prove that they've had the vaccine to get on with their lives. And so the government is arguing against something that's actually in the best interest of individuals and the economy to fend off a theoretical concern that doesn't exist. I don't understand why the government just doesn't get on and say, yes, of course you can have an electronic confirmation of a vaccine, and that way you can get on and live your life.
I said it on the weekend, I'll repeat it again. Your GP holds the record of your vaccination, so you can easily gain access to it for you personally if you need it. I would just step back a second and say, I might disagree with you on this in the sense that, we were describing a few minutes ago a world where we're going to have annual vaccination programs in the way we do flu. No one needs a flu passport. Once the whole world has had the vaccine, and then
that I get. Okay, that I get. The point is, you don't want the. Okay, I understand that. Can I? While we're talking about the UK and our relationship with the world, can we just talk about vaccine nationalism? And I know that there's been a good deal of talk about the EU and our relationship with the EU. Actually, I wanted to know what you think is our responsibility to the world currently, given the rate of vaccinations, the stockpile of vaccinations that you've built up, and the pressure among our neighboring countries, among countries around the world for vaccine. How do you get some equity in the world around vaccine distribution?
So let me just correct one thing. I wish I had a stockpile. I don't have a stockpile. Vaccines remain finite, and that is the determining factor at the moment as to how fast I can vaccinate and protect the most vulnerable top 9 cohorts, and then phase 2, and then ultimately the whole of the adult population. So although we have ordered 407 million vaccine doses, we only have 3 vaccines that are approved. The others are in different stages of approval. And so I don't want the audience to think that we're sitting on a sort of mountain of vaccines and just sort of going at the rate that we can, because that's all the NHS can do. The deployment infrastructure we've built, and I described it earlier, we got to touching 1,000 jabs a minute. So you can do the maths and work backwards the size of the deployment infrastructure that we can do. And vaccines are the limiting factor. When Boris Johnson asked us to stand up the vaccines task force, he gave the vaccines task force under Kate Bingham and now under the great leadership of Clive Dix 2 remits. Remit number 1 is, find out who is going to produce the best vaccine and try and get an option or some of the production as early as possible and work with them, including make sure you've got the ability to produce in the UK, which is what we did on spec by investing in production in the UK for AstraZeneca, Oxford, for Novavax to be produced on Teesside, for Valneva, which will be produced in Scotland. And the second remit, James, is he said, we want you to be able to have a strategy to help the rest of the world. That was from day one, from the moment the vaccine task force was set up. So we've always had that remit in place. Now, what we're going to do is make sure that we have enough vaccine doses to offer the vaccine to the adult population of the UK. And some vaccine manufacturers are now looking at gaining regulatory approval for their vaccine for adolescents or children. Then we'll have to make sure we have that available if they are approved. And then, of course, look at our excess doses, excess supply, and make sure we help the rest of the world. We already are. We've put £500 million into COVAX, which has already begun deploying in the rest of the world with the AstraZeneca vaccine and Pfizer vaccine through COVAX, which is run by the WHO. And we're the largest contributor to that.
Yes, sorry, forgive me for interrupting, just because I'm aware of time. I just wanted to bring in Claire, Dr. Claire, let me see if I've just caught her name, who's just asked the question much better than I did. Claire Kotecki is her name. Forgive me, Claire.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
I brought you in not least because you say that you're a doctor. I don't know whether you are a doctor.
I'm a biologist doctor, not
Okay.
an MD doctor.
So
But
do you want to put the point to Nadine that you put? And I'm just aware of time, so let's keep it quick.
yeah, I'm just very concerned about the morality of vaccinating non-high risk groups in our country, where there are countries who are without vaccines and cannot vaccinate their high risk groups. And in that context, I don't see it as a victory that we are actually vaccinating all our population. I see it actually as something that's a very bleak area morally. And I'm worried that we come out of this COVID pandemic phase and the legacy will actually not be vaccine nationalism, but will be vaccine poverty in many ways. And we will actually have a vaccination divide in the country. And I wondered what you'd think about that.
Claire,
Thank you for the question. I think I'm on record as saying that, of course, we want to vaccinate the UK adult population, but nobody's safe until the whole world is safe, which is why from day one, the remit for the Vaccines Task Force was to look at vaccines that we think will work, and secondly, how do we help the world to also get vaccinated. It's why we've put £500 million into COVAX, the largest contribution by capita by more than any country in the world, and we're urging other countries to do the same. It's why Boris Johnson led the Gavi conference that got 8.8 billion, I think, pledged to help the rest of the world. And we'll continue to do that. But my absolute, priority has to be to vaccinate phase one, those who are most vulnerable to hospitalization, serious illness, and death from the COVID virus. That's 99% of mortality in phase one, and then to be able to then move on to the phase two, and then offer it for the adult population. The reason we are then able to do even more than we're doing now with COVAX. So we're not waiting till we vaccinate the whole country. I don't want you to think that. The reason we're not waiting is because we're putting big resource into COVAX, which is starting now. I saw some brilliant work over the weekend that we're doing in Kenya and other parts of the world now with the Pfizer vaccine, because we're sharing knowledge with them of how to use that. And that's being delivered through COVAX, so that $500 million that we've put to work. But at some point, we will have excess vaccines as well, and we want to make sure we use those as a further contribution to our global effort of vaccinating the world. But nobody's safe till the whole world is safe.
Nadine, thank you so much, Claire. 2 or 3 points just to say on the vaccine passports, because there's a lot of heat in the chat about it. One is I see that Carrie Simpson Wright suggests that maybe your colleague Matt Hancock has an app up his sleeve for this. One thing to about to mention to him. 2, I see that Anne Cairns of MasterCard actually make the point that actually organizations like MasterCard are beginning to think about digital solutions to this with the WHO. And for what it's worth, I note that Tom Callum says that actually you're not at fault of this, but I am, but I let you off the hook on passports. And we should be much clearer, it should force you to say, sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with this problem. But in the last 5 minutes, Nadine, I wanted to actually ask you to stand back and just help us understand what has been learned from this. So the first question I've got is, the vaccine rollout, we started by saying, has been an extraordinary achievement. I see Sharon Redrobe is asking a question though about test, trace, and isolate. You know, PPE, test, trace, and isolate, clearly both examples where the government had a much less successful time. It took much longer and much greater public anxiety and frustration. What was the difference? Was it that you ran vaccines through the existing infrastructure of the NHS and tried to build something new, both in test, trace, and isolate and PPE? Was that the difference? Was that possibly a mistake?
Thank you for that question. So a lot to unpack there. So PPE was very different because we only had the capability to produce about 1% of our PPE requirement at the outset of this pandemic. And therefore, there was a global rush to try and book as much PPE from manufacturers all around the world, China and elsewhere. And that was a very different challenge to the vaccine challenge. 2 on test, trace, and isolate, it was to stand up another giant piece of infrastructure, which now can do 800,000 PCR tests a day. That's the capacity. And of course, we've just added to it even more with the lateral flow tests that both businesses, large and small, can use, as we've just announced. And of course, the surge testing and isolation is going to become very important. So we've had 147 cases of the South African variant. We've been so strong at surging into Woking and Worcestershire that for the last 2 days, we haven't seen a single additional case, which is good news in that sense. So that's going to be part of the way out of this, obviously, is through vaccination, but also through test, trace, and isolate rapidly. And that's also in place. I guess if I reflect on this in the last few minutes, the NHS has a fantastic track record of doing flu vaccination. But to put it into context globally, globally, flu vaccination is about 600 million doses. We're talking about 4 or 5 billion doses here of vaccines that we're going to have to deploy for the whole world. The NHS didn't do this on its own. The back-end distribution of cold chain vaccine, the Pfizer-BioNTech, we needed the back-end distribution arm of Boots and Superdrug and Movianto, right? The front-end distribution to the GPs has to be done by a brilliant distributor called DHL, because we want to run it in the same way. And I hope we get to a stage where GP can track their order in the way you track your Amazon order. And so it is a combination of the private sector who developed the vaccines in the first place, but they're also integrated into the deployment. The militaries have been an incredibly part of this, the volunteers, local government. So a combination of some great institutions, and I would never take anything away from the NHS, the GPs, the nurses, the doctors, the hospital hub. Has been a tremendous coming together of everything that's great about the United Kingdom. If you're asking me what makes it great, is our ability to organize and deploy. That is one thing we are good at.
And can I ask you, and Nadhim, can I ask you too, that this may be an unfairly emotional question, but when you and fellow ministers talk privately about the number of deaths, 112,000 deaths from COVID-19, do you think the mood amongst ministers in the government is a sense of guilt, that you feel that this is your fault, or that somehow the country was just unlucky?
No, I think I feel a sense of sadness, sorrow, heartbreak, because that statistic includes my uncle, which some of you would have probably seen me talk about. It is a terrible, grim figure and outcome. But I just, if I look at how people have behaved, ministers and otherwise, and I spent 10 years of my life before entering politics, observing human behavior and reporting on it at YouGov. Everybody is working literally night and day, whether it's the Prime Minister who follows every step I do, literally on a sort of almost an hourly basis, because he's so anxious that we protect the most vulnerable so quickly. His priority was to say we've got to get into the care homes and protect them. So we did the first 6 care home pilot the week before Christmas, and we've just completed end of January over 10,000 care homes. And to the question earlier, how do we know the NHS did it? Well, that care homes who haven't been protected would have been on the front page of every newspaper if that didn't happen. And so I think, Matt Hancock has been working 7 days a week, 19 hours. I don't know how, in many ways, where he gets the sort of the energy from. It is pretty incredible what is happening. Of course, there'll be an inquiry after this, because that's how we do things. That's how we learn. That's how we better ourselves.
And I suppose what I'm asking, and I suppose what I'm asking is really whether or not, in the analysis of it, you think actually the reason for the number of deaths in the UK is structural. These were problems in the way in which our society operates, and it's revealed certain things about the UK, or whether or not the government is responsible. It was a set of choices that were made at a government level that were mistakes.
So I was getting to that point. We will have an inquiry. We're good at actually looking into and learning lessons through the inquiry process. I can't give you an answer because I'm not a virologist, I'm not an expert on this, but we will bring everyone in front of an inquiry, and then we will set out exactly what happened and learn the lessons for future pandemics from this. All I can say to you, when you ask me the question on a sort of human level, what am I seeing? I'm seeing, you know, a bunch of civil servants who are working night and day, and I have to say they are the unsung heroes of this. I can name, you know, those in my team: Emily Lawson, Ruth Todd, Maddie McTurnan. You know, these are amazing people. Genuinely, I say to you, right? Department of Health and Social Care with the NHS have incredible human beings doing amazing things. I think it's hard to sort of, you know, whilst you're in the middle of a pandemic, to sort of say, oh, I think this is the, if there's this one decision, if that changed everything, things would have been different. This is hard on every country, and we're seeing it everywhere, including, of course, in a little later on, I think just appeared on the screen behind me. But it is tough everywhere, and we're seeing it all around the world. But I think the important thing, if you ask me from this, is we have to be able to hold that inquiry and learn the lessons, because that's how we create better government and governance and better services that ultimately serve, you know, all of us as citizens and taxpayers.
Nadhim, just to say, thank you for your time. You're about to be upstaged, I think, enter stage right. So I realise that we've gone a few minutes longer than planned. Thank you to you for your time.
This is Mia.
Hello there. Thanks for joining us. And by the way, I'm just thanking your dad. I mentioned this to your daughter. I'm just thanking your dad for his time with us. Will you also, by the way, I appreciate, Nadhim, you saying at the end there, thank you to the Emily and Ruth and Maddie and the people on the team. You know, we do genuinely know, if we don't know them by name, the amount of work that people are doing. So I appreciate that. A big thank you to you for sparing the time and coming on and talking so candidly. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this ThinkIn. My apologies that I didn't get to everyone's points or everyone's questions. As you can imagine, there are a lot. But for now, have a good evening, stay safe, keep warm. Thanks so much, both of you, for joining us.